The transit hub at Kethsorving was not a place designed for waiting. It was designed for throughput, bodies moving from one authorization window to the next, documents stamped, clearances logged, manifests reconciled, and then the bodies continuing onward to wherever the Empire needed them. The ceilings were low by Velareth standards, which meant they were still higher than most human construction, but the gray composite panels and the recessed blue-white light strips gave the space a functional, institutional plainness that I had always found easier to navigate than the ornate public chambers of the inner districts. Nobody looked at you in a transit hub. Everyone was occupied with their own paperwork. I had been navigating transit hubs for 7 years. The Kethsorving hub occupied the lower ring of the orbital station of the same name, a fuel and logistics waypoint 2 transit jumps from the Imperial Center, significant enough to handle high-volume contractor clearances, but unglamorous enough that senior Imperial staff rarely visited. That was part of why I had accepted the contract. The Solvith consolidated routing work had brought me through 4 outer ring stations in the past 3 years, and the work was real enough: manifest auditing, cargo reconciliation, routing optimization for bulk haul operations, that my contractor profile had accumulated a respectable record of completed engagements. I was listed in the Compact Logistics Registry as Davin Sorrel, Independent Routing Specialist, Human, 44 years of age, Clearance Tier 3. I had been Davin Sorrel for 6 years and 4 months. I was not Davin Sorrel. I want to explain how that works, or at least how it worked for me, because the easy version, the man hiding from his past, running from his mistakes, building a false life in the outer territories, is not quite accurate, and I would prefer to be accurate. The Kareth border collapse had killed 83 people and produced 14 presumed dead determinations. I was number 9 on the presumed dead list, and the evidence was solid enough that I did not blame the Reconciliation Office for closing the case. I had been recorded aboard the transport. The transport had been destroyed. They had physical evidence consistent with an attaché having been present at the time of the collapse. The determination met threshold. That was not their error. That was the record. What I had done, in the 6 months between the collapse and the moment I filed for a compact provisional worker identity under the name Davin Sorrel at a mid-territories consular outpost, was a longer calculation than it should have been. I had done it wrong. I had weighed the complications of returning, the casualty record, the false departure circumstances, the awkward fact of being a man the Empire had officially processed as dead, and I had weighted them too heavily against the complications of staying away. I had told myself the return window was closing, and then I had told myself it had closed, and then I had stopped examining the question as carefully as it deserved, and had put the professional competence that I had been applying to the question of whether to go home into the question of how to be Davin Sorrel convincingly. Davin Sorrel had been a routing specialist in the outer territories for 6 years. He was quiet, reliable, methodical, and not particularly memorable. The outer ring stations dealt in bulk contractors by the hundreds, and a human routing specialist who did accurate work and didn't create administrative complications was the kind of person the logistics coordinators were glad to see and didn't examine closely. I was good at the work. That had not been a performance. The manifest auditing and the cargo reconciliation genuinely required the same kind of careful documentary attention that I had spent 3 years applying to cultural briefings at the Imperial Court, and I was methodical enough to find the work satisfying in the straightforward way that competent work is satisfying when you are not thinking about anything else. I had been not thinking about anything else for 6 years and 4 months. Davin Sorrel had been a routing specialist in the outer territories for 6 years. He was quiet, reliable, methodical, and not particularly memorable. The outer ring stations dealt in bulk contractors by the hundreds, and a human routing specialist who did accurate work and didn't create administrative complications was the kind of person the logistics coordinators were glad to see and didn't examine closely. I was good at the work. That had not been a performance. The manifest auditing and the cargo reconciliation genuinely required the same kind of careful documentary attention that I had spent 3 years applying to cultural briefings at the imperial court, and I was methodical enough to find the work satisfying in the straightforward way that competent work is satisfying when you are doing it well. The outer territories were genuinely unglamorous. The Velrath Outer Ring was the furthest inhabited sector from the imperial center, and the stations that dotted the Sorvith corridor were the kind of infrastructure installations that functioned because someone maintained them and not for any more poetic reason. I had quarters on 3 different stations over 6 years, small, standard issue, adequate. I ate in contractor mess halls. I attended to my work. I made the acquaintance of other contractors and logistics officers and the kind of mid-career imperial administrators who found themselves posted to unglamorous places and had made their peace with it, and I found these acquaintances easy to maintain at exactly the depth they were at. Nobody in the outer territories was curious about your history. History was what you had before the outer territories. Out here, you had your work and your clearances and your contractor record, and as long as those were in order, nobody asked what came before. I had been not thinking about anything else for 6 years and 4 months. The Solvith Consolidated Routing Tender had come through on a standard post. When I saw Kethsorvin listed as the primary site, I had looked at it for longer than a new contract posting usually warranted. Kethsorvin was 2 transit jumps from the Imperial Center. That was close, closer than I had been in 5 years, and I had a particular relationship with proximity to the center that I had not examined carefully in some time. I told myself the station was unglamorous, outer ring adjacent in character despite its distance, that senior Imperial staff rarely visited, that the routing work was clean. I told myself these things several times, more than was probably necessary for a straightforward contracting decision, and then I filed the tender application. I queued at authorization window 11 and placed my documentation chip on the reader. The authorization clerk, a young Velarith male with the pale jade skin common to the southern provinces, professional and unhurried, lifted the chip, inserted it into the secondary reader, and watched his terminal. I watched the side of his face, which was a habit I had developed. Terminal operators have a characteristic expression when a document processes cleanly, mild, forward-facing, already beginning to reach for the stamp. When something flags, the expression changes before they do anything else. A slight tension around the eye, a barely perceptible pause in the reaching hand. I had learned to read that pause the way a pilot reads turbulence, early, so I had time to decide what to do next. The clerk's hand stopped reaching. He looked at his terminal for 2 full seconds without moving. Then he looked at me with an expression that was not alarm. Authorization clerks were trained out of alarm, but was the careful professional neutrality of a person who has found something unexpected and is deciding how to characterize it. Routing Specialist Sorrel, he said. Your clearance file has generated an identity reconciliation flag. This is a processing delay, not a denial. Could you take a seat in the annex anteroom, the corridor to my left, and someone from Identity Records will come to assist you? Of course, I said. I took my documentation chip back, picked up my bag, and walked to the corridor. The annex anteroom was a small room with 4 composite chairs, a low table with a water dispenser, and no windows. The lighting was the same blue-white as the main floor. A second door at the far end was closed. I sat in the chair nearest the outer wall, which was also the chair farthest from the second door, and I set my bag between my feet and I thought about the flag. I had expected something like this eventually. I had not expected it here, at Kethsorvin, on a routine contractor clearance for a bulk haul routing optimization contract. I had expected it somewhere louder and more consequential, somewhere I would have had more options. But the Empire's record systems were thorough, and biometric matching had improved significantly in the 7 years since the Kareth border collapse, and I had known since the first year that the identity I was carrying would eventually produce a reconciliation flag somewhere. The question had always been what kind of flag, and what came next. I knew what the flag was. I had known my own casualty record existed since the 2nd year, when a compact consular officer in the Velrath Outer Territories had mentioned, conversationally, that the Kareth collapse had produced 83 confirmed casualties and 14 presumed dead determinations, and that the Imperial Casualty Reconciliation Office had processed all 97 records within the year. I had been one of the 14. My biometric data was on file at the time of the collapse. Every compact attaché went through full biometric registration upon assignment, and the Reconciliation Office had matched it to the physical evidence recovered from the transport wreckage. I had been listed as Sol and Drave, compact cultural attaché, confirmed deceased, Kareth border sector, Imperial year 4417. The man sitting in the anteroom chair was biometrically identical to a man who had been dead for 7 years. That was the flag. I sat with that for a while. The water dispenser hummed. The second door remained closed. I thought about the routing work that was waiting, 3 weeks of system audits, a routing model reconfigured for the new fuel depot at Keth Sorvin's outer ring, and I thought about what came after a priority identity anomaly flag in an Imperial transit hub, and I thought about how I had been managing the question of returning for 6 years, and whether the managing had been honest. It had not been honest. I had stayed away because it was easier than returning. That was the accurate version, stripped of the administrative complications I had used as justification. The casualty record was real, the identity correction would be complicated, the compact notification would be a significant professional disruption. All of that was true, and none of it was the reason. The reason was that I had decided, somewhere in the first year, that returning would require confronting what I had left behind. And the thing I had left behind was not a posting or a career file, but a Velsorath record that I was certain, because it would be the efficient and reasonable thing, had been closed in the first months of the confirmed death determination. I had built the certainty carefully over 6 years without examining it. What I had not done in 6 years was test it. I had not asked any of the compact consular contacts I still occasionally encountered whether the Velsorath records of the confirmed dead were routinely closed in the first year. I had not looked for any record of the practice. I had arrived at the certainty by the most efficient route available, deciding it was true and not checking, and I had maintained it with the same efficiency. The outer territories were good for that kind of decision. Nothing out there encouraged you to look back. The second door opened. The woman who came through was not an identity records clerk. I knew this immediately, and not because of her clothes, which were the understated gray and ivory of senior Imperial administrative staff, rather than the blue and silver of records processing. I knew it because I recognized her the way you recognize something that has been the fixed point of a long navigation, without surprise, with a clarity that is almost physical, the kind of recognition that arrives before your reasoning mind has processed what your eyes have seen. Vithai Sorvin was the Velareth Empress. She had been the Empress for 11 years. I had served as compact cultural attaché to the Imperial Court for 3 of those years, from 4412 to 4414, and then for 6 months of 4415 before the Kareth assignment that had produced my casualty record, and subsequently 7 years of Davin Sorrel. She had not changed in ways I could catalog precisely. The deep bronze red of her skin was the same, warm and slightly luminous in certain lights, the color of old polished copper just before it tones toward green, which it never quite did. Her hair was the same dark shade threaded through with the fine copper filaments that the Velareth elder houses wove in as a marker of sovereign lineage. though it was dressed more plainly than I remembered from formal occasions, pulled back without the full ceremonial arrangement, the copper threading visible but not ornate. Her eyes were pale gold, which I had always thought was an unusual combination with the bronze-red skin, and they were precisely as I remembered them, attentive in a particular way, registering everything without appearing to work at it. She stopped 3 meters from where I was sitting. I stood, reflex. You stand when the Empress enters a room. That had been installed in me during the first week of the attaché assignment, and apparently it had stayed. For a moment, neither of us spoke. I was aware that I should say something. I was aware that the correct thing to say was probably something identifying and procedural, my real name, spoken aloud, in a place where it had not been spoken in 7 years. I was also aware that I did not know what she knew, or what had brought her through that door, or what the identity reconciliation flag had produced on whatever terminal she had been reading when it came through. Sorvin Station's Identity Records Office, I said, which was not my name but was something to say. I understood there was a flag on my clearance. Her expression was the most careful thing I had seen in 7 years. There was a quality to it that I could not immediately name, not surprise, because surprise was too quick and too unmanaged for what I was looking at. Not anger, though I would not have been surprised by anger. Something more controlled than either, and underneath the control, something that made the carefully composed surface feel like significant effort. Solendrave, she said. Not a question, not an accusation. A name spoken in the Velareth first form acknowledged presence address, which is the form used when you are naming a person you have recognized and are claiming to have seen. I had heard it used in official contexts, sovereigns addressing their court, commanders naming a soldier before a commendation, but I had only heard it directed at a human being once before, in a very different room, a long time ago. I said yes. One word, because it was the only answer, and because everything else I might have said required knowing what question she was actually asking, and I did not know that yet. She looked at me for a moment. Then she moved to the chair across the low table from mine, not the nearest chair but the one that was directly opposite, and she sat in it with the particular economy of movement that Senior Velareth developed, nothing wasted, nothing performed, the body doing exactly what the situation required and no more. I sat back down, because standing while she sat felt wrong in a way I couldn't articulate. The water dispenser hummed. The outer door was closed. We were alone in a gray anteroom 2 jumps from the Imperial Center, and Vithai Sorvin had just said my name. How long, she said, have you been in the outer territories? 6 years, I said, 4 months. And before that? The border sectors, Velrath Outer Ring, the Sorvith Corridor. I paused. The 6 months after the collapse were difficult to navigate. I was not prepared for them. No, she said, and something in that single syllable carried a weight I didn't try to interpret. You were not listed among the survivors. I know. The transport manifest recorded you aboard. The wreckage produced sufficient physical evidence. The Reconciliation Office closed the record in the same year. I know, I said again. I was listed as Solendrave, Compact Cultural Attaché, confirmed deceased, Kareth Border Sector, Imperial Year 4417. Confirmed dead, she said. Not presumed. The office issued a confirmed determination. I did not say anything to that. She looked at the table between us. The low table held nothing but the water dispenser and its paper cups. She looked at it the way a person looks at a surface when they are working out how to say something accurately. The identity reconciliation flag was generated by a biometric match, she said. Your retinal pattern and bone structure scan were matched against the compact attaché registry at a confidence of 97.4%. The registry match triggered a cross-reference to the casualty record. A live biometric filing matched to a confirmed dead record is categorized as a priority identity anomaly. Priority identity anomalies at this station are routed to the station archive officer. A brief pause. I am the station archive officer today. I looked at her. You are the Empress, I said. I am also today the station archive officer for Sorving, because I was in the archive annex reviewing records when the flag generated, and the archive officer on shift offered the assignment to me when she saw what had flagged. The pale gold eyes met mine. She had some awareness of the record I was reviewing when the flag came through. She thought I should handle it personally. The record she was reviewing. I turned that over carefully. What record? I said. Sorvin reached into the interior pocket of her administrative jacket, the motion unhurried, deliberate, and placed a data chip on the low table between us. It was a standard imperial archive chip, the kind used for personal record storage, gray with a single gold contact strip. I had seen thousands of them in my 3 years at the court. But this one had a small mark on the upper left corner, a pressed seal, not a printed one, the kind that required physical application from a sovereign instrument. I had seen that seal twice in my 3 years at court. Both times it had been on documents of the highest personal category, not official, not administrative, but personal. The Velarith called the category Velsorath Personal Archive, the sovereign record of acknowledged persons. I looked at the chip. That is a Velsorath record, I said. Yes. Those records are sealed. Yes, she said. They are sealed to everyone except the sovereign who created them and the person named in them. There was a long pause. And you are showing it to me, I said slowly, because the person named in it is sitting across this table from me, she said, and has been listed as dead for 7 years, and I have not closed the record, and I do not intend to close it, and I would like him to know that. I did not move for a moment. The thing about working under a false identity for 7 years is that it requires a particular management of the self, a careful partition between what you are and what you are presenting yourself to be, maintained constantly, applied to every interaction, every document, every conversation. You become very practiced at the neutral expression and the deflecting answer and the efficient pivot to safer ground. What you lose, gradually and without noticing until it is very far gone, is the capacity to receive a direct statement of recognition without the reflex to manage it. I managed it now. I kept my expression even. I looked at the chip on the table. I would like to understand, I said, what it means that the record was not closed. She looked at me steadily. It means that when my advisors recommended, twice in the 2nd year after the collapse, and once in the 4th year, that the personal records of the confirmed dead be reconciled and closed, I declined to close yours. On what basis? On the basis that I was not satisfied with the determination. She said it plainly. No apology in it, no defense. Just the fact, stated. The Reconciliation Office works from physical evidence and manifest records. The Karath collapse produced transport wreckage distributed across a significant debris field. The physical evidence was consistent with an attaché having been aboard. It was also consistent with an attaché having disembarked before the departure window and having not been recorded as having done so, because the departure manifest was partially corrupted, and the boarding records for that transport had not been fully reconciled at the time of the collapse. I raised this with the Reconciliation Office in the 1st year. They noted it and maintained the confirmed determination on the grounds that the evidence met the required threshold. It did meet the threshold, I said. Yes, she said. I know, I read the report. A pause. I read it 4 times. I looked at the chip again. The press seal caught the light, small, precise, the kind of mark that required intention to make. The Velsorath Archive, I said, the record of acknowledged persons. Those records are entered at the sovereign's personal discretion, not at the recommendation of the court, not through an official designation process. That is correct. You entered my name in that record. In the third month of 4414, she said, before the Karath assignment. I had been the compact cultural attaché for most of 4413 and all of 4414 before the Karath assignment in early 4415. The third month of 4414 meant she had entered the record 17 months into my posting, a year and a half of work that I had thought of as useful and professionally satisfying, and nothing more significant than that. A year and a half of liaison work, cultural briefings, protocol consultations, the slow and unglamorous labor of ensuring that compact representatives understood what the Velareth court expected of them, and that the court understood what the compact was actually asking. I had eaten meals in the working staff annex. I had spent a great deal of time in the lower archive, reading records that no compact attaché before me had bothered to read. I had asked questions that other attachés had apparently considered beneath their professional dignity, about things like the history of the Velsoth mourning form and the social meaning of the copper threading in sovereign hairdressing, and why certain words in Old Velareth had been retained in modern administrative language when the rest of the vocabulary had shifted. I had considered all of this basic professional competence and had not thought about what it looked like from the other side of the briefing table. I would like to understand, I said carefully, what I did in the third month of 4414 that produced a Velsorath record entry. For the first time since she had come through the door, Vithai Sorvin's expression shifted, not by much, and not in a direction I could immediately label. Something that passed quickly across the pale gold eyes and was contained again with the long practice of a person accustomed to not letting things pass uncontained. You attended the 31st Velareth Archive Review, she said, which is a procedural function that senior court staff are required to attend, and which most of them find adequately described by the word procedural. You arrived before the session began. You had brought the third volume of the Sorvin Historical Commentary, which is a text that has been in the lower archive since the founding of the station and which I had mentioned, in passing, 6 weeks earlier during a briefing about the historical development of the Velsorath designation. You had read the relevant sections. You had marked them with questions. A brief pause. 3 of the questions were ones I had not been asked before, not in 11 years on the throne. Not by any advisor, any diplomat, any court historian. I remembered the book. I remembered marking it with a folded corner because I had run out of the small adhesive tabs I usually used for research marking. I had not thought about why I was marking it specifically. I had thought it was an interesting text with some passages that didn't parse cleanly given what I'd learned from other sources, and the questions had seemed like the obvious professional thing to bring to a person who would know the answers. You had questions, she said, about why the Velsorath designation, the sovereign record of acknowledged persons, was extended in the fourth era of the empire to include persons outside the ruling lineage. You asked whether the historical record reflected a genuine philosophical change in how the Velareth sovereign understood the concept of personhood, or whether it was a pragmatic political expansion with the philosophical framing added afterward. And you asked, she paused again. Precisely. The way a person pauses when they are choosing the most accurate words for something they have thought about at length. You asked what it cost to enter a person in the Velsorath record, not the formal procedure, the actual cost. You said, the archive says the entry is made at the sovereign's personal discretion with no external authorization required. But discretion implies a weight to the decision. What is the weight? I remembered asking that. I remembered it more clearly than I remembered most of the things from that period. The specific phrasing of the question, the way I had hesitated before asking it because it had seemed like it might be too personal for a briefing context. I had asked it anyway because the text had seemed to require the question, and I was not good at leaving things unasked. You answered it, I said. I told you that the Velsorath entry was the most personal act available to a Velarith sovereign, she said. That it carried no formal power, no rights transferred, no obligations created, no court precedent set. That it existed entirely in the sovereign record, seen only by the sovereign and the named person. That it was, in precise terms, a private statement by the person who held the most public position in the empire, saying, "I have seen you. You exist to me not as a function or a title or a useful presence, but as a person I have looked at and recognized." I told you that the weight of the entry was the totality of what it meant, that a sovereign who entered a person in the Velsorath record was committing, privately and without external witness, to that recognition. She looked at me. The pale gold eyes were steady. "You said," she continued, "that sounds like an extremely serious thing to do." And I said that it was, and you nodded and turned to a different section of the text because you had other questions, and I entered your name in the record the following week. The water dispenser hummed. I looked at the table. The chip sat on the gray composite surface, the gold contact strip catching the light. 7 years. She had held a Velsorath record for a confirmed dead man for 7 years, and declined twice to close it, and been reading it in the archive annex of Kethsorvin Station, when a biometric flag came through the authorization system, and put the confirmed dead man in a gray anteroom 30 meters from where she was sitting. I was not practiced at receiving this. I want to be accurate about that. I had 7 years of careful neutrality, 7 years of efficient professional distance, 7 years of being Davin Sorrel in every room I walked into, and none of that preparation was useful for what was sitting on a low table in front of me. "I have to tell you something," I said. "Yes," she said. "The Kareth assignment. I was not aboard the transport at the time of the collapse." "No," she said. "I had disembarked 40 minutes before the departure window. There was a discrepancy in the manifest, a routing designation that didn't match the cargo classification I'd been briefed on, and I went back into the station to query it with the cargo officer. The departure window closed while I was in the office. I was still in the station when the collapse occurred." I paused. "The cargo officer did not survive. The station records were badly damaged." I was not on any survivor manifest because I hadn't been recorded as having returned to the station. I was recorded only as having boarded. "Yes," she said again. "You knew this." I considered it possible. The manifest discrepancy was in the partial records. I found it in the 4th year. By that point, the determination had been confirmed for 3 years, and the Reconciliation Office had no grounds to revisit it without new evidence. And I had no new evidence, only an inconsistency in a corrupted document and a 7-year-old flag on a Velsorath record that my advisors had told me 3 separate times to close. "But you didn't close it." "No." I looked at her. She was looking at the chip, not at me, and for a moment the careful composure showed something underneath it. Not the surface shift I had seen earlier, but something quieter and more sustained, the expression of a person who has been holding a particular weight for a long time and is now, for the first time, in the room with the person who can take part of it from them. "I should have come back," I said. She looked up. "Yes." I told myself I couldn't. The casualty record, the false identity, the 7 years of working under a name that isn't mine. I told myself coming back would create more problems than it resolved. I stopped, started again. I was not honest with myself about why I stayed away. "No," she said, "people rarely are." I stayed because I thought the record would be closed. I thought the Velsorath. The word felt different in my mouth here than it had in briefings. I thought it would have been closed in the 1st year. I thought it would have been the efficient and reasonable thing to do for a confirmed dead attaché who had not been particularly exceptional and who had been gone for 7 years. I stayed away because I had decided without asking that the record was closed. Vithai Sorvin was quiet for a moment. "You were not," she said, "unexceptional." The way she said it was not an elaboration. It was a correction, precise and without sentiment, the kind of correction that a person makes when an inaccurate claim has been stated as fact and needs to be addressed. I had used those exact words in compact debriefings before. You were not unexceptional, and I had heard them used by Velareth court officers to convey a very specific thing. The record does not support your characterization of the event. The record does not support your characterization of yourself. You asked what it costs to acknowledge a person, she said. You asked that question because you had read the text carefully enough to understand that the Velsorath entry was not a formality, that it required the sovereign to mean it. That is not a question a person asks if they are only doing their job. It is a question a person asks because they understand that meaning a thing matters. She looked at the chip. I understood, after you asked it, that you were the kind of person who understood that. The kind who reads the text that no one else reads and brings the questions that no one else thinks to ask, not to advance a position or to manage an impression, but because the questions are real and they are there and you cannot leave them unasked. A pause. That is not unexceptional. That is rare. I held that. The anteroom was very quiet. I looked for you, I said. In the first year, not the way I should have looked, not officially, but I looked. I went through every compact survivor registry in the border sectors. I checked the Velrath outer ring. I looked for any record that might have been generated by someone moving through those territories in the wrong direction for a dead man. I stopped. I didn't find anything, and I told myself that was confirmation. You were being careful, she said. I was being invisible. It is not the same thing. The pale gold eyes met mine. No, she said, it is not. I looked for 2 years and then I stopped looking and I told myself the stopping was acceptance. I looked at the chip. It was not acceptance. It was the choice to stop asking a question that was going to cost me something, and I dressed the choice up as something more dignified than it was. She listened to this without expression. Not the blank professional neutrality of a court function. The attentive, registering quality that I had noticed 12 years ago. The kind of listening that meant she was actually there in the room with you and was absorbing what you said at full weight rather than processing it through a filter. I don't know, I said. What happens next? I want to be clear about that. I have a contractor identity that has been functioning for 6 years. I have a casualty record. I have a biometric flag on a transit clearance that is currently unresolved. I gestured briefly at the room, the door, the general situation. I am aware that the practical circumstances of this conversation are complicated. They are, she said. The identity anomaly will need to be formally resolved. The casualty record will need to be corrected. The compact registry will need to be notified. There is a procedural process for each of these, and they are not simple, and they will take time. Yes. They are also, she said, entirely solvable. They are paperwork problems. The Empire has more experience with paperwork than with most things. The faintest alteration in her expression, not quite a smile, but the possibility of one, contained at the last moment. I have reviewed the relevant procedures. I was aware it was possible they might be needed. She had reviewed the reconciliation and identity correction procedures for a man listed as dead for 7 years. She had done this before today. She had done this at some point during the 7 years when she was holding an unresolved Velsorath record and declining to close it. When did you review them? I said. The 2nd year, she said. When I declined to close the record the first time, I wanted to know what the correction process would require if the determination were found to be in error. I reviewed them again in the 4th year when I found the manifest discrepancy. A pause. I updated my notes on them last month, when the Solvith Consolidated Routing Tender was posted, and a contractor named Davin Sorrell was among the applicants, and the routing specialty and the geographical history and the 3-second biometric match I did on the name against my own records suggested that Davin Sorrell was not, in fact, Davin Sorrell. I sat with that for a moment. You knew, I said. I strongly suspected, she said. 3-second biometric matches are not court standard. I did not act on it. I continued reviewing records and waited to see if the clearance flag would confirm it. A pause. It did. I had come to Confronting because the contract was clean and the pay was fair, and because I had been telling myself for 7 years that I had run out of reasons to return. I had come here and walked into an authorization window and placed my documentation chip on a reader, and a clerk's hand had stopped reaching. And now I was sitting in a gray anteroom with the Velareth Empress and a Velsorath record chip on the table between us. And she had spent 7 years not closing the record, and she had reviewed the identity correction procedures in the 2nd year, and she had matched my biometric against a contractor tender last month and waited. SciFi, I said. Her name, without the title, the way compact attachés were permitted to address the Empress in working sessions. A convention that I had used throughout the posting and which I had not used since, because there had been no occasion to use it, because I had been dead. The pale gold eyes held mine. I am sorry, I said, for the 7 years, for not finding a way back sooner, for deciding without asking that the record was closed. She did not perform her response. She did not reach for the measured diplomatic form. She looked at me with the same steadiness she had maintained since she came through the door, the composure of a person who has been holding a long wait and is not going to let go of it carelessly just because the person it had been held for is finally in the room, and she said, "The record was not closed. It has not been closed. It will not be closed." Present tense, future tense, both. I hear you, I said. She picked up the chip from the table and held it for a moment. In the blue-white light of the anteroom, the pressed seal was clearly visible, small and precise, the Velareth sovereign mark, applied by hand to a personal archive record 17 months into a posting that I had thought of as ordinary professional work. I watched her hold it. Then she set it down in front of me. "The Velsorath record," she said, "belongs to the named person and the sovereign who created it. You are the named person. You should have it." I looked at it. I did not pick it up immediately. I looked at it the way you look at something that has been a fixed point of navigation for so long that confronting its physical reality requires a moment of adjustment. The transition from the map to the territory. The understanding that the thing you had been orienting yourself against existed in 3 dimensions and could be held. "There will be a great deal of paperwork," I said. "Yes. The identity correction, the casualty record, the compact notification, the contractor registration." Yes, the faintest pause. "You were also, at the time of your posting, technically still under a compact cultural attaché appointment that was suspended rather than formally terminated, because the confirmed death determination did not constitute a formal appointment termination under the relevant regulations." I checked. Another pause. "There may also be paperwork about that." I looked at her. "Are you telling me," I said, "that I have been technically employed for 7 years? Suspended from service, not terminated. The distinction is meaningful in the regulatory context." The possibility of a smile was more definite now. "I did not say anything to the compact registry about this discovery. I thought you might prefer to be present for that particular conversation." 7 years. 7 years of routing audits and manifest reconciliation under a borrowed name, and the appointment I had been carrying the institutional ghost of the whole time was technically still active in an administrative database in the Imperial Center, waiting for someone to notice. "I would prefer to be present for it," I said. "Good." She looked at the chip on the table and then at me. "I should tell you one more thing. When my advisors recommended the 2nd time that the Velsorath record of a confirmed dead attaché be closed, the senior court advisor used the phrase, understandably attached. He meant it as a diplomatic way of describing a decision he found irrational. I did not find it irrational. I found that I knew something he did not, which was that the record was correct, that the entry had been made for a real person whose absence from the record of the acknowledged would be an inaccuracy, and that I was not in the business of maintaining inaccuracies in the personal archive. A pause. I told him the decision was final. And it was. It was, she looked at me steadily. The Velsorath entry is not rescinded. It was made in the third month of 4414 when a compact cultural attaché brought a 700-year-old archive text to a procedural session and asked what it actually cost to acknowledge a person. That entry is part of the sovereign record. It does not expire. It does not require renewal. It means exactly what it meant when I made it. She paused. You have been a person I have seen, soul and drave, for 12 years. 7 of them were difficult. The rest can be less so. I picked up the chip. It was lighter than I expected. Personal archive chips always are. The weight of what they contain doesn't translate to the physical object. It sat in my palm, the gold contact strip warm from the table, the pressed seal under my thumb. 12 years. She had been counting from the beginning, not from the entry date, not from the Karath collapse, but from the start of the posting, the first day I walked into the court as a compact cultural attaché who asked too many questions about the lower archive and ate in the working staff annex and brought annotated texts to procedural sessions. 12 years from where she was standing, and 7 of them had been the long, unresolved weight of a Velsorath record kept open against the advice of everyone around her. Reviewed and maintained and brought into an archive, Annex 2 jumps from the Imperial Center on the day. A routing tender from the outer territories had a name on it that didn't entirely add up. There is a great deal of work to do, I said. Yes. The paperwork alone will take weeks. At minimum. I stopped, tried again. I should tell you that I am a competent routing specialist. Whatever else needs to be addressed, the Solvith Consolidated Contract is a real engagement. I intend to complete it. Vithai Sorvin looked at me with an expression I had no precise name for, something between the careful composure she had maintained since she came through the door, and something warmer and less managed underneath it. The quality of a person who has been holding a particular patience for a very long time, and is now, finally, in a moment where the patience is no longer required. I would expect nothing less, she said. I held the chip. In the anteroom, the water dispenser hummed its single low note. Outside the station, 2 transit jumps from the Imperial Center, the Empire continued its ordinary business, ships in their lanes, manifests in their queues, clearances stamping through in their sequence. The routing work was real. The paperwork was real. The 12 years were real, and the 7 that had gone wrong inside them, and the pressed seal on the chip in my palm. Welcome back, she said. I didn't say anything. Some things don't need an answer. They need to be heard and held, and acknowledged in the plain way that means you understand what is being given to you. I had asked, once, what it actually cost to enter a person in the Velsorath record. She had told me. I had written down the answer and turned to the next section, because I had other questions, because I had not understood then what kind of answer I had been given. I understood now. The anteroom door opened at the far end. A junior records officer, professional and unhurried, stood in the doorway with a tablet and the expression of a person who has been given an unusual assignment and is managing it carefully. When you are ready, she said, to both of us equally, we can begin the identity reconciliation process. We're ready, I said. I stood. Vithai Sorvin stood beside me. The chip was in my jacket pocket. The water dispenser was still humming. Ahead of us was the reconciliation process and the casualty record correction and the compact notification, and whatever it meant to be Solon Drave again in a place where that name had a 7-year gap in its record. It was a great deal of paperwork. It was, all of it, solvable. The Empire had experience with paperwork. And the Velsorath record was in my pocket, entered 12 years ago in the third month of 4414, never closed, carried forward through 7 years of a man not being where he should have been. And that, too, was part of the record now. I walked through the door, she walked beside me. The work was waiting and we went to meet it.